Thank you, Imam Khalid. Before we move on, I'd just like to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Imam Khalid, kindly jot them down on the note cards that look like this. You would have found them on your chairs when you first came in, and our volunteers will take them from you on the right and the left. نشكر الإمام خالد على مشاركته. متحدثتنا التالية كاتبة مختصة في شؤون الشرق الأوسط وحائزة على شهادة في علم النفس. أمضت السنوات العشرة السابقة في بحوث مكثفة في مجالات تجمع بين السياسات والدين في الماضي والحاضر. مارست عملها على مدى 13 سنة في القدس، لتنتقل بعد إذن إلى الولايات المتحدة، واليوم تعمل على كتابها The First Muslim، وهو عبارة عن نظرة حديثة في حياة النبي محمد عليه الصلاة والسلام. رحبوا معي بليزلي هيزلتون. Please welcome our next speaker, Lesley Hazelton.
There's a wonderful saying on the homepage of the Sheikh Salama Foundation. And it goes, "Ma kharaja min al-qalb, dakhala al-qalb." What comes from the heart goes to the heart. So, min al-qalb. 4 years ago, halfway around the world from Abu Dhabi in misty Seattle, I woke every morning to what I knew was an impossible question, especially for an agnostic Jew like myself. And that question was, what actually happened on Layl al-Qadr, the night of power, that Ramadan night in the year 610, when Muhammad received the first Quranic revelation up on Mount Hira, near Mecca? There can, of course, be no definitive answer to this question. I knew it was impossible. Layl al-Qadr is the core mystical moment of Islam. It's by definition beyond human comprehension. So, you could say that this is a case of fools rushing in where angels fear to tread. But then the truth is, I'd far rather be a fool for trying than a different kind of fool for not trying. Not least because in the earliest account we have, that of Ibn Ishaq, what particularly intrigued me was not even so much what happened as what did not happen that night. Muhammad did not come floating off the mountain as though walking on air. He did not radiate light and joy. There were no choirs of angels, no music of the spheres, no elation, no ecstasy, no golden aura surrounding him, not even the whole of the Quran fully revealed, but just those first 5 brief, exquisite verses. In short, he did none of the things that might make it easy to cry foul, to say that the whole account is nothing but an invention, right? A cover for something as mundane as human, just ambition, personal ambition. Quite the opposite. Sorry, gone blank. Chalk it up to jet lag. Quite the opposite, because Muhammad himself, according to Ibn Ishaq, and in his own words, reported by Ibn Ishaq, was convinced that what had happened could not have been real. At best, he thought it had to be a hallucination, his own mind working against him. At worst, possession, and he'd been seized by an evil jinn, a spirit out to deceive him, even to crush the life out of him. And in fact, the story goes, he was so convinced that he was literally majnoon, possessed by a jinn, that when he found himself still alive, his first impulse was to finish the job himself, to leap off the highest cliff and escape the terror of what he'd experienced by putting an end to all experience. So the man who fled down the mountain that night trembled not with joy, but with fear. And that panicked disorientation, that sundering of everything familiar, that feeling of being utterly overwhelmed by something far larger than the mind can comprehend, can only be called awe. Now, I know this can be difficult to grasp today when the word awesome is used to describe a new app or the latest Ferrari, and god-awful is attached to a bad meal or a rotten movie. We've kind of lost touch with that sense of what it is, of real awe. With the exception, perhaps, of a massive earthquake, we close ourselves in, we hunker down, convinced that we're in control, or at least hoping for control, and forget sometimes that such a thing exists. So how then are we to understand Muhammad's awe? Well, we could begin with the idea of inspiration. And in its original meaning, inspiration is the act of breathing in or being breathed into. And in Arabic, as in Hebrew, the same word is used for both breath and spirit. So the idea of having spirit breathed into you is built into the language, as in the second verse of Genesis, where the Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim, lay upon the waters. And this sounds kind of wonderful put that way, but then consider that a human being is not water. So imagine being breathed into, inspired with such force that your body can hardly bear it. We're not talking about a gentle breath from heaven here, but air being impelled into your lungs under immense pressure, like a giant, as though a giant is giving you mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Even as it gives you life, it seems to be squashing the life out of you, suffocating you under its enormous weight. And then consider how Muhammad described this experience to Khadija, the woman he fled to that night, the woman to whom he was married in a loving, monogamous relationship for 24 years until her death. It was as though these words were being engraved on my heart, he said. So we have to try then to imagine the unimaginable, a sharp blade carving deep inside you as you lie beneath it, conscious but unable even to struggle against it. The closest I can come is open heart surgery, the wrenching apart of the rib cage, the baring of the heart. Imagine that without anesthetic. But perhaps we don't need to imagine, because the sheer humanness of Muhammad's reaction that night, 1400 years ago, 1402 years ago to be precise, the sheer humanness of his reaction is testament to its reality. Jet lag. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, and whether you believe that the words he heard came from inside him or outside him, it doesn't matter. It's clear that Muhammad experienced them, that they were real for him, he experienced them, and that what he heard did shatter his sense of himself and the world in order to rebuild it into something radically new. Fear in the face of something like this was the only sane reaction. It was the only human reaction. And yet there are some people for whom it is too human. They insist that Muhammad never doubted, not even for a single moment. They demand perfection and cannot tolerate even a single moment of human imperfection. And yet imperfection, it seems to me, is what keeps faith with faith. Without it, without the awareness of human fallibility, there is only a terrifying certainty. A refusal to think, to reason, to question, to do all the things the Quran constantly urges people to do, carrying on a kind of Socratic dialogue with doubt. And yet today, so many hundreds of years later, so many people seem to lack any sense of doubt. They seem so very, very certain. And many of them will quote the Quran to prove it. In fact, they've made quoting the Quran into something of a theopolitical industry. The Quran, as you know, is not an easy book to read. So instead of being read, it's often simply quoted. And I do mean simply. As with the flood of quotations from the Bible, the quotations from the Quran are very often highly selective and out of context, which means, of course, that they're not really quotations at all, they're misquotations. And it's not only non-Muslims who do this. The people who use the Quran this way are both Muslim and non-Muslim. That is, both Islamic fundamentalists and their counterparts, Islamophobes. Both groups use what I call the highlighter version of the Quran. They feed each other the same out-of-context quotes, the ones they've marked in fluorescent yellow pen, and reinforce each other's prejudices to the extent that the highlighter version actually includes ideas and phrases that aren't there, like the infamous 72 virgins in paradise, who only came into being much later as a result of a very strangely sexualized misreading of the original Arabic. Or far more devastatingly, the concept of jihad, a word used consistently throughout the Quran for the struggle to lead one's life in the way of God, as it says, Sabil Illahi. A concept that I think in many ways might be compared to the Tao, the way or the path of Buddhism. The Quran uses other words for combat and warfare. And in fact, the idea of jihad as armed struggle only came into being much later, way after Muhammad's death, and in fact at just about the same time as those 72 virgins in paradise. Now, I only realized this when I sat down a few months after I asked that original question. I sat down to read the Quran as closely as I could. For me, this meant sitting down with 4 translations to read them simultaneously alongside a transliteration and the original Arabic and, of course, a very good dictionary. And I set aside 3 weeks for this task, which is indeed what is meant by the word hubris. It took 3 months. And ever since then, I've been asked what surprised me most about reading the Quran this way. But the strange thing is that for once I do actually have an answer. And the answer is how flexible the Quran is. At least in minds that are not fundamentally inflexible. It even reflects on its own flexibility. Some of these verses are definite in meaning, it says, and others are ambiguous. The perverse at heart will eagerly pursue the ambiguities, trying to create discord by pinning down meanings of their own. Only God knows the true meaning. And this might be something to bear in mind the next time someone thumps a Bible or waves a Quran and yells, and they always do seem to yell, "This is what it says." The phrase, God is subtle, Allah Latifun Khabir appears several times. And indeed, the whole of the Quran seems to me far more subtle than most non-Muslims, and evidently a good number of Muslims, have been led to believe. It contains the awareness that there are things that cannot be stated directly, that can only be approached through metaphor, which allows room for the mind to soar, to leap between the known and the unknown. And this, as I see it, is why fundamentalism is not only dangerous, it's dull. It dulls the mind by insisting on the literal. It literally dumbs down the sacred. All the world's great sacred texts use poetry and metaphor, which is why they resonate. It's why they've grasped the human imagination for so many centuries. They reverberate through our cultures. Just as the Quran reverberates through Muslim culture, so the Hebrew Bible reverberates through Jewish culture, and the King James Bible through Western Christian culture. And if we leave no room for them to reverberate, if we insist on the most literal readings, then we lose that capacity to soar, to move from the surface, the outside, the shell, to the soul. If you have no feel for metaphor, then fundamentalism is for you. If you're threatened by paradox, fundamentalism is for you. If uncertainty drives you crazy, fundamentalism is for you. But then, as I see it, all you'll be left with is that outer shell, like a nutshell, a pecan nut. It's all glossy and shiny and seemingly perfect. But unless you open it, you'll never even know what the meat of the pecan tastes like. In fact, you'll never even know it exists. So, at risk of being incredibly simplistic myself here, I would venture, in the broadest possible terms, that there are two major paths, two ways of religious experience. One of these is to expand the sense of self in awe and wonder and humility and gratitude. And this is, in fact, what the Quran urges. The other is to close oneself in behind high walls of absolute certainty and righteousness, by which I mean a kind of overweening pride in being so very right. The former expands your sense of the world and of other people. The latter constricts it, contracts it, setting you off, pitting you against the rest of the world. Now, you could say that if someone wants to tie their mind into a straitjacket this way, that's their choice and their problem. And in fact, I'd agree with you, except that our problem is that such a mind cannot accept that others may think differently. It has no respect for the minds of others, let alone their lives. It dehumanizes others. In its eagerness to be right, it devolves into fanaticism. Judgment belongs to God alone, it says in the Quran, and is one measure of just how obscenely a sacred text can be distorted, that the earliest extremists in Islam, followers of Muhammad's son-in-law Ali, who turned against him when he agreed to arbitration instead of battle, adopted this as their war cry. The assassin who slashed at Ali with his knife shouted this very line as he did so: "Judgment belongs to God alone," without realizing, it seems, that so it does. To God and not to humans. So the terrible irony here is that even as these men were so adamantly quoting the Quran, they were at the same time denying it by insisting that they had the right to judge for God. They acted as though, that is, as though they were God. Is this what's called heresy? In religious terms, I think it is. In secular terms, it's certainly the most stunning arrogance, which, as you know, is exactly what the Quran repeatedly warns against. So the arrogant, as I see it, are the real co-religionists. Whether they're Al-Qaeda suicide bombers, Messianic Israeli settlers, American neo-Nazis like the man who shot 6 people in a Sikh temple the day before yesterday in Wisconsin, sadists like the so-called Islamists in northern Mali. They are all brothers in arms. They are literally blood brothers, other people's blood. And militant fundamentalism is really a religion all its own. Or rather, it's an anti-religion, because it knows nothing of humility, let alone compassion. It has no heart. All it has is that shiny, glossy, impermeable shell of righteousness with nothing inside, or more accurately, less than nothing, because it kills the soul. As an agnostic, that is, as someone who places her faith not in answers but in inquiry, I often hesitate to say that I know something for sure. But after spending 4 years in the company of Muhammad as a writer, I am sure of this. Muhammad himself would be utterly appalled and horrified by some of what is being said and done in his name today and in the name of God, in exactly the same way as Jesus would be horrified and appalled by some of what is being said and done today in his name and in the name of the same God. Allow me to close then with a quote, but one I think is needed as part of the discussion. And if it seems a strange one for me to close with, considering its source, so much the better. It's from the New Testament, from the second epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, where he wrote this: "The letter kills, the Spirit gives life." 7 words I wish were quoted a lot more often. Thank you for listening, and Ramadan Kareem.